October the 6th, 1941. 23 kilometers southwest of Msensk, Russia. The morning fog hung thick over the birch forests as Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 35th Panzer Regiment of the 4th Panzer Division, studied the road ahead through his binoculars. The 42-year-old veteran of Poland and France felt confident. His regiment had swept across hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory in just 4 months, destroying everything the Red Army threw at them. The Russians were beaten. Everyone knew it. Moscow would fall within weeks. Then, through the swirling mist, shapes began to emerge. Tanks. But not the pitiful T-26 and BT-7s his panzers had been crushing since June. These were different, larger, moving with unusual speed across terrain that should have been impassable. Eberbach grabbed his radio handset. Unknown enemy armour, estimate 20 vehicles, approaching from northeast. All units prepare to engage. What happened in the next 90 minutes would shatter every assumption the German High Command held about Soviet armour capabilities. Within 3 hours, Eberbach's regiment would be in full retreat, leaving behind 43 destroyed panzers and the shattered certainty that German armour superiority was anything but guaranteed. The tank emerging from that October fog was the T-34 model 1941, and its appearance marked the moment when the German military realised they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. This is the story of how a single weapon system changed the calculus of the Eastern Front, how German tankers went from supreme confidence to existential dread, and how the Soviets built a machine that would roll all the way to Berlin. The T-34's origins lay in the harsh lessons of the Spanish Civil War and the disastrous Winter War against Finland. Soviet tank designer Mikhail Koshkin understood what many of his contemporaries did not, that future wars would be decided not by small numbers of heavy breakthrough tanks, but by mass production of vehicles that combined firepower, protection, and mobility in revolutionary proportions. In 1937, Koshkin began work at the Kharkov locomotive factory on what would become the A-32, the direct predecessor to the T-34. Soviet military doctrine of the period emphasized the deep operation, massive armoured thrusts that would penetrate enemy lines and drive into the operational rear, destroying command structures and supply lines. This required tanks that could travel hundreds of kilometres without mechanical failure, fight effectively against anti-tank weapons, and be produced in numbers that would overwhelm any opponent. The design Koshkin created was radical. Sloped armour that would deflect rather than absorb incoming rounds. A powerful diesel engine that was safer and more fuel-efficient than gasoline. Wide tracks that distributed weight and allowed movement across mud, snow and sand that would bog down conventional tanks. And a 76.2mm main gun that could destroy any tank then in service. When the prototype was completed in January 1940, it weighed 26 tons, could reach 33 miles per hour, and mounted armour that was effectively twice as thick as its measurements suggested due to the revolutionary sloping. Soviet testing was brutal. Koshkin personally drove the prototype from Kharkov to Moscow, a journey of over 750 kilometres, to demonstrate the design to Soviet leadership. Then, despite official authorization to transport the vehicle by rail, he drove it back to Kharkov. The 1,500-kilometre trial in the depths of winter proved the design's remarkable reliability. Koshkin contracted pneumonia during the journey and died months later, but his creation was approved for immediate mass production. The first T-34s rolled off the production line in September 1940. By June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army possessed approximately 200 of the new tanks scattered across multiple mechanized corps. German intelligence had no idea they existed. The German army that crashed across the Soviet border that summer morning was the most experienced, best-equipped military force in the world. The panzer divisions had perfected combined arms warfare in Poland and France. Their standard tanks, the Panzer III with its 50mm gun, and the Panzer IV with its short-barreled 75mm, had proven more than adequate against Polish 7TPs, French Sommers and Char B1s, and British Matildas. German doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and combined arms. Tanks would break through, infantry would consolidate, and tactical air power would destroy anything that threatened the advance. It had worked flawlessly for 2 years. The assumption was that Soviet equipment would be even more primitive than what they had already faced. German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength at around 10,000 vehicles, but dismissed them as obsolete designs operated by poorly trained crews following rigid, predictable doctrine. The reports weren't entirely wrong. The bulk of Soviet armour in June 1941 consisted of light T-26 infantry tanks and BT-series cavalry tanks, both designs from the early 1930s with thin armour and inadequate guns. These vehicles were slaughtered by the thousands in the opening weeks of Barbarossa. The Panzer III's 50mm gun could penetrate their armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. The 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank gun, which had struggled against French and British heavy tanks, proved perfectly adequate against most Soviet armour. German tank crews developed a dangerous confidence. Russian tanks were death traps, poorly designed, inadequately armoured, and crewed by men with minimal training. Obergefreiter Karl Fuchs of the 7th Panzer Division wrote home in July 1941, "The Russian tanks burn beautifully. Our guns go through their thin armour like paper. We have destroyed hundreds. They just keep sending more, but it makes no difference. We will be in Moscow before the leaves fall." The first encounters with T-34s in June and July 1941 were isolated and confused. German after-action reports mention heavy enemy tanks that proved difficult to destroy, but the chaos of the opening offensive prevented systematic analysis. Tank battles occurred at point-blank range amid burning villages and retreating Soviet columns. T-34s appeared, fought briefly, and either withdrew or were destroyed by massed anti-tank fire or Luftwaffe strikes. What German commanders noticed, when they had time to notice anything, was troubling. These new Soviet tanks could absorb hits from the 50mm gun that should have been lethal. Their own guns seemed effective against German armour at ranges where German guns struggled to penetrate in return. They moved across terrain that bogged down panzers. They appeared suddenly and withdrew quickly, refusing the kind of static engagement where German tactical superiority could prevail. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, a tank battalion commander with extensive combat experience from Spain, France, and the opening weeks of Barbarossa, encountered T-34s in late July near Smolensk. His report to division headquarters was one of the first to identify the new Soviet tank as a distinct threat. Engaged enemy heavy tanks at 800 metres, observed 37mm and 50mm hits with no penetration. Enemy gun appears to be 76mm type, effective at ranges exceeding our own weapons. Armour is sloped, causing deflection of rounds that should penetrate. Mobility superior to our own vehicles across broken terrain. Recommend immediate investigation and countermeasures. The report was filed and forgotten. The German advance was succeeding beyond all expectations. Soviet mechanized corps were being annihilated, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were being taken, and Moscow seemed within reach. The existence of a superior Soviet tank, if it existed at all, was a minor tactical problem that would be solved through standard German advantages in training, tactics, and air support. This assumption would be tested to destruction at Msensk in October 1941. The 4th Panzer Division, part of General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, was driving toward Tula, the last major city before Moscow. The division was one of Germany's best, filled with veterans who had fought across Europe. Their confidence was absolute. Then they ran into Brigade Commander Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, one of the few Soviet armoured formations that remained intact and properly organised in the chaos of 1941. Katukov was one of the Red Army's most skilled armour commanders, a rarity in a force that had been gutted by Stalin's purges just years before. He understood that Soviet tactical doctrine, which emphasised massed frontal assaults, was suicidal against German combined arms teams. Instead, he positioned his T-34s in concealed defensive positions along the German axis of advance, planning to use the fog and terrain to negate German advantages. On October 6th, as Eberbach's regiment advanced down the Msensk road, Katukov sprung his ambush. 20 T-34s emerged from concealment at ranges of 500 to 800 metres and opened fire. The German tankers were stunned. The Soviet tanks were moving at speeds that seemed impossible for vehicles of their size. Their 76.2mm guns were destroying Panzer IIIs and IVs with single shots. Return fire was bouncing off the sloped armour at angles that defied every lesson German gunners had learned. Lieutenant Gustav Schrodeck, commanding a platoon of Panzer IIIs, watched his entire unit destroyed in less than 5 minutes. His personal account, written in a field hospital days later, captured the shock. They came out of the fog like ghosts. Enormous tanks moving faster than our own. We opened fire at 700 meters. Good hits. We saw the shells strike. They bounced off, just ricocheted away like stones off water. Then they fired. Schneider's tank exploded, just gone. One shot, then Bergmann, then Müller. I was screaming into the radio telling everyone to fall back, but there was nowhere to go. One of them came straight at my position. I fired 4 rounds. Everyone hit. Everyone bounced off. Then he fired. I remember light, heat, and screaming. That's all. The battle lasted through the day as Katukov's T-34s used their mobility to strike from unexpected directions, destroy German tanks, and withdraw before artillery or airstrikes could be called in. When darkness finally ended the engagement, Eberbach's regiment had lost 43 panzers destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Katukov's brigade lost 6 T-34s, 5 to close-range flank shots and 1 to a lucky hit from an 88mm flak gun that had been pressed into the anti-tank role. The exchange ratio was unlike anything the panzer divisions had experienced. Guderian himself visited the battlefield the next morning. The normally confident panzer leader was visibly shaken. He immediately ordered his staff to compile a detailed report on the new Soviet tank. The resulting document, sent to Army Group Center headquarters and forwarded to Berlin, was apocalyptic in tone. On this day, the superiority of Russian 26-ton tank over our Panzer III and IV was clearly demonstrated. The Russian tanks are faster, more heavily armoured, and have a gun that is effective at ranges where our weapons are useless. Our 50mm gun can only penetrate the T-34 at very close range, and only with flank or rear shots. The 37mm is completely ineffective. The 75mm on the Panzer IV can destroy them, but only with high explosive rounds at close range, an extremely dangerous proposition. The armour is sloped in such a way that even perfect hits often ricochet harmlessly. The T-34 can cross terrain that stops our tanks cold. We observed them moving across mud that had our vehicles completely bogged. Their wide tracks give them ground pressure significantly lower than our own designs. Most disturbing is their operational range and mechanical reliability. Interrogated prisoners report that these tanks can travel 250 to 300 kilometers without refueling or maintenance. Our own tanks require extensive maintenance every 50 to 100 kilometers. If the Russians possess these tanks in quantity, and if they can solve their tactical and organizational problems, we face a crisis. Current German tanks are inadequate. Immediate development of new designs or substantial upgrades to existing vehicles is essential. The report landed in Berlin like a bombshell. German tank designers and military officials simply didn't believe it at first. How could the technically backward Soviets have created a tank superior to German designs? The panzers had conquered Europe. The idea that Slavic subhumans, as Nazi ideology insisted, could produce better weapons was ideologically unacceptable. General Oberst Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on October 20th, 1941, "Reports from the front regarding a new Russian heavy tank are concerning but may be exaggerated. Frontline troops tend to overestimate enemy capabilities after setbacks. Nevertheless, investigation is warranted. The investigation came in the form of a special commission sent to the front to examine captured T-34s and interview tank crews who had faced them. The commission included representatives from the Army Weapons Office, designers from leading German tank manufacturers, and experienced panzer officers. What they found confirmed Guderian's worst fears and added new concerns. The T-34 model 1941 weighed 26.5 tons and was powered by a V12 diesel engine producing 500 horsepower. This gave it a remarkable power-to-weight ratio of 18.8 horsepower per ton, significantly better than German tanks. Top speed was 33 miles per hour on roads, and remarkably, the tank could sustain 15 to 20 miles per hour across rough terrain where panzers struggled to make 5. The armour was 45mm thick on the front hull and turret, but sloped at 60 degrees from vertical. This meant that incoming rounds had to penetrate an effective thickness of 90mm. For comparison, the Panzer II's frontal armour was 50mm but vertical, meaning 50mm of actual protection. The T-34's armour was nearly twice as effective despite being nominally thinner. The 76.2mm F-34 main gun could penetrate 70mm of vertical armour at 1,000 metres. This meant it could destroy any German tank in service from ranges where German guns could not penetrate in return. The gun could fire armour-piercing high explosive and shrapnel rounds, giving it excellent versatility. The tracks were 500mm wide, 19.7 inches, compared to 400mm on the Panzer III. This created ground pressure of only 0.62 kilograms per square centimetre, about half that of German medium tanks. The T-34 could cross mud, snow, sand and swamps that completely immobilized panzers. The Christie suspension system, inherited from American designer J. Walter Christie, gave the tank remarkable cross-country speed and crew comfort. The large road wheels and long suspension travel allowed the T-34 to maintain speed over terrain that forced German tanks to slow to a crawl. The diesel engine was less flammable than gasoline and more fuel efficient. The V2 engine could run on diesel, kerosene or in emergencies, heating oil or even crude oil. Fuel capacity was 460 litres internally, plus provision for 3 external drums adding another 135 litres. Operational range exceeded 300 kilometres, about 185 miles without refuelling. German tanks typically needed refuelling every 60 to 90 miles. The German Commission's report, completed in November 1941, was both admiring and terrified. The T-34 is the finest tank in current service with any army. It combines adequate firepower, excellent armour protection, through innovative sloping, superior mobility, and operational range that exceeds our designs by a factor of 2 or more. The individual components are often crude by German standards. The engine is unsophisticated, the transmission is primitive, the turret traverse is manual and slow, the optics are poor, the crew ergonomics are terrible. 2 men must operate the turret, loading and firing the gun while the commander attempts to acquire targets and direct the tank. Vision devices are minimal. Radio equipment is often absent in all but command tanks, yet despite these deficiencies, the overall design is brilliant. The Soviets have created a tank that does not need to be sophisticated, because its fundamental characteristics, firepower, protection and mobility, are so superior that tactical and technical deficiencies become secondary. A poorly trained crew in a T-34 is more dangerous than a well-trained crew in a Panzer III. The report recommended immediate development of new German tanks incorporating the lessons of the T-34, specifically sloped armour and a gun capable of defeating 90mm of effective armour at combat ranges. In the meantime, it suggested tactical countermeasures, use of 88mm flak guns in the anti-tank role, close coordination with infantry and engineers to negate Soviet mobility advantages, and attacks on the T-34's weaknesses, specifically its poor crew ergonomics and lack of situational awareness. But weapons development takes time, and the war would not wait. Through the winter of 1941 and 1942, German tank crews developed desperate tactics to survive against T-34s. The 88mm Flak 36, originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, became the only reliable T-34 killer. Its high-velocity armour-piercing round could penetrate the T-34's frontal armour out to 2,000 metres. Every panzer division began keeping 88s as close to the front as possible, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. The 88's effectiveness came at a cost. The gun was massive, required a crew of 10, and took precious time to deploy. T-34s learned to identify and prioritise 88 positions, often destroying them before they could fire. Close-range ambushes became standard German doctrine. Since the 50mm gun could only penetrate T-34 armour at ranges under 500 metres, and only from the side or rear, German tanks would hide in concealment and wait for T-34s to pass, then fire into their more vulnerable sides or engine compartments. Pak 40 75mm anti-tank guns were rushed into production and deployment. These guns could penetrate T-34 frontal armour at ranges up to 1,000 metres, but they were heavy, difficult to conceal, and available in limited numbers through 1942. Combat engineers began extensive use of mines and improvised explosives. Telemines, magnetic charges, and satchel charges could disable or destroy T-34s if infantry could get close enough. The problem was getting close enough against a tank that could machine gun infantry at range and simply drive away from threats. German infantry learned to fear the sound of T-34 engines. Unlike the high-pitched whine of Panzer gasoline engines, The diesel V12 produced a distinctive deep rumble that carried for kilometers. Soldiers developed the ability to identify T-34s by sound alone, giving them precious seconds to seek cover. Gefreiter Hans Becker, a Panzergrenadier with the Grossdeutschland division, recalled the psychological impact. You would hear that sound and your stomach would drop. Everyone knew what it meant. The 88s might not be in position. Your own tanks might be kilometers away. And these Soviet monsters would come rolling out of the tree line, machine guns firing, that big gun swiveling. You felt naked. Our anti-tank rifles were useless. Panzerfaust didn't exist yet. Magnetic mines required you to run up to a moving tank while it was shooting at you. Men did it. Crazy brave men, but most died trying. I saw a T-34 run over a machine gun position once. The tank didn't even slow down, just crushed them into the mud and kept going. The tracks were so wide they didn't even leave recognizable bodies. After that, when you heard that diesel rumble, you ran. Not walked. Ran. The Winter War of 1941 to 1942 demonstrated another T-34 advantage. While German armour was immobilized by cold mechanical failures and lack of winterized equipment, T-34s operated effectively in temperatures that stopped panzers cold. The diesel engines, already difficult to start in extreme cold, could be kept warm with small fires under the hull. The wide tracks prevented the tank from sinking in snow. Soviet crews, equipped for winter warfare, maintained operational effectiveness while German tankers froze. During the Soviet counter-offensive that winter, T-34s spearheaded attacks that drove the Wehrmacht back from Moscow's gates. German units reported T-34s appearing suddenly from snowstorms, destroying supply columns and rear area installations, then disappearing before air support or heavy weapons could respond. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, operations officer of ex-Jans-SS Panzer Corps, wrote in his memoirs, "The winter of war 1941 to 1942 was when we truly understood what we faced. The T-34 was not just superior technically. It was designed for the war we were actually fighting rather than the war we had planned. We had created excellent tanks for fighting in Central Europe against similarly equipped forces. The Russians had created a tank for fighting across the endless spaces of their homeland against any enemy foolish enough to invade. Their crude manufacturing, which we had mocked, meant tanks could be repaired in field workshops with minimal tools. Our sophisticated equipment required factory-level facilities to fix when damaged. Their wide tracks and simple design meant conscript crews with minimal training could operate them effectively. Our complex systems required skilled operators who were increasingly difficult to replace. Most humbling was discovering that the T-34 was designed for mass production from the beginning. While we crafted each panzer like a watch, they stamped out T-34s like artillery shells. By early 1942, the production disparity was becoming clear. German factories produced approximately 1,500 Panzer IIIs and IVs in the first quarter of 1942. Soviet factories, many of them hastily relocated east of the Urals to escape the German advance, produced over 3,000 T-34s in the same period. The Soviets were replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The T-34's design enabled this mass production. The hull was made of large rolled armour plates welded together, requiring relatively little machining. The turret was cast as a single piece, faster and cheaper than the elaborate face-hardened plates used on German tanks. The suspension used large road wheels with rubber rims, simpler and more durable than German interleaved wheel systems. The engine, transmission, and final drives were designed as easily removable modules. A trained crew could replace an entire engine in the field in under 12 hours. German tanks required specialized equipment and often days of work for similar repairs. Component standardization meant that parts from different T-34s were largely interchangeable. German tanks were hand-fitted, with parts often requiring custom machining to fit properly. Soviet manufacturing philosophy, born of necessity and pragmatism, had created a tank that could be produced by semi-skilled workers, many of them women and teenagers, in factories that had been farms and forests just months before. The famous Tank-Ograd tractor factory in Stalingrad was producing 250 T-34s per month by early 1942, while simultaneously serving as a fortress during the battle for the city. Workers would complete tanks on the factory floor, drive them directly into combat a few hundred meters away, and return to build more if they survived. German intelligence was slow to grasp the scale of Soviet production. Reports of thousands of T-34s were dismissed as exaggerations. Surely the primitive Soviet economy, ravaged by German conquest of its industrial heartland, could not sustain such production. But the Soviets had accomplished one of the greatest industrial evacuations in history. Between July and November 1941, over 500 industrial enterprises were dismantled and moved east, including the Kharkov locomotive factory where the T-34 was born. These factories were reassembled in the Urals and Siberia, often operating in the open air before buildings could be constructed. Workers laboured in temperatures that would have shut down Western factories. Production continued through the winter of 1941 to 1942 as German forces stalled before Moscow. By spring 1942, Soviet tank production was exceeding pre-war levels. The T-34 was being manufactured at an astounding rate, prioritised above almost everything else. Food, consumer goods, even housing were sacrificed to the production of tanks. The results were staggering. In 1942, Soviet factories produced approximately 12,500 T-34s. Germany produced roughly 6,000 tanks of all types in the same year. The numerical disparity was becoming insurmountable, but numbers alone don't tell the full story. The T-34's combat effectiveness was evolving as Soviet tactical doctrine improved. The disasters of 1941, where superior T-34s were squandered in piecemeal attacks and encirclements, gave way to more sophisticated employment. General Pavel Rotmistrov, who would command the 5th Guards tank army at Kursk, was one of the architects of improved Soviet armour tactics. He understood that the T-34's advantages in mobility and firepower could only be fully exploited through combined arms operations similar to German doctrine. By mid-1942, Soviet tank brigades were operating with integral infantry, artillery and engineer support. T-34s would advance behind rolling artillery barrages, break through German defensive positions, and exploit into the rear area. Infantry and trucks or riding on the tanks themselves would consolidate gains. The Germans found themselves facing tactics eerily similar to their own Blitzkrieg, but executed with greater numbers and vehicles that could absorb punishment that would destroy panzers. The Battle of Stalingrad saw relatively little tank combat due to the urban environment, but the surrounding steppe witnessed massive armoured clashes. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counter-offensive that encircled the German 6th Army, was spearheaded by T-34 equipped tank corps that smashed through Romanian and Italian positions and drove deep into the German rear. Hauptmann Hans Schäufler, commanding a company of Panzer IVs with the 22nd Panzer Division attempting to relieve Stalingrad, encountered the massed Soviet armour in December 1942. His account captured the shock of facing T-34s in quantity. They came at us in waves, not dozens, hundreds. Our intelligence said a regiment. This was an army. We destroyed the first line, maybe 20 tanks. Then another line appeared. We killed those, then more. Our ammunition was running low. We called for resupply. Before it arrived, they overran. The position. I saw one of my tanks hit a T-34 4 times at 600 metres. Good hits, centre mass. The T-34 kept coming, fired once, and my tank exploded. That's when I understood. They didn't need to be better than us tank for tank. They just needed to be good enough and have 10 times our numbers. They had both. The relief attempt failed. Stalingrad fell, and the German army began its long retreat. German industry and military planners were not idle. The shock of the T-34 spurred development of new tanks and anti-tank weapons. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, with a short-barreled 75mm gun, was upgunned with the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40. This weapon could penetrate T-34 frontal armour at ranges up to 1,000 metres, finally giving Germany a medium tank that could fight T-34s on equal terms, at least regarding firepower. But the improved Panzer IV was still not T-34's equal in mobility or armour protection. Its vertical armour remained vulnerable to the T-34's gun at combat ranges. Production numbers, while increasing, could not match Soviet output. More significantly, Germany began development of entirely new heavy tanks designed specifically to counter the T-34. The Panzer V Panther incorporated nearly every lesson learned from the T-34. Sloped armour, powerful 75mm long gun, wide tracks, improved suspension. The Panther, when it finally entered service in mid-1943, was arguably the finest medium tank of the war. But its development took time, its mechanical complexity led to reliability problems, and its cost and production requirements meant Germany could never build Panthers in numbers approaching T-34 production. The Panzer VI Tiger, with its 88mm gun and massive armour, could destroy T-34s at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. But Tigers were expensive, mechanically complex, and produced in tiny numbers compared to T-34s. From 1942 to 1945, Germany produced 1,347 Tigers. In the same period, the Soviet Union produced over 50,000 T-34s. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable. Even if every Tiger destroyed 5 T-34s before being disabled, and many did, the numbers still favoured the Soviets. Meanwhile, the T-34 itself was evolving. The model 1943 introduced a new hexagonal turret with improved internal space and better armour distribution. More significantly, Soviet designers were working on an upgunned variant that would answer the Tiger threat. The T-34-85, mounting an 85mm gun in a 3-man turret, began production in early 1944. This variant could penetrate Tiger frontal armour at practical combat ranges, while maintaining the T-34's mobility and reliability advantages. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented both the peak of German armoured power and the beginning of its end. The Wehrmacht assembled its largest armoured force for a double envelopment of Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including new Panthers and Tigers, would attack from north and south, encircle Soviet forces, and replicate the stunning victories of 1941 and 1942. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. Intelligence had provided extensive warning. The Red Army prepared defences in depth, minefields, anti-tank positions, and reserve formations positioned to counterattack. At the heart of these defences were T-34 brigades, positioned in concealed positions and prepared to execute the kind of mobile defence that Kutukov had pioneered at Msensk nearly 2 years before. The southern pincer of the German attack, spearheaded by Tomy SS Panzer Corps with over 700 tanks, including significant numbers of Tigers and Panthers, advanced into a meat grinder. Mines channeled German armour into kill zones where T-34s engaged from prepared positions. The superior German optics and crew training allowed them to score kills at long range, but the mass of Soviet armour was overwhelming. For every T-34 destroyed, 2 more appeared. On July 12th, at Prokhorovka, the war's largest tank battle occurred. General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, with over 600 tanks, mostly T-34s, launched a massive counterattack against the 2 SS Panzer Corps. The battle devolved into a swirling close-range melee where German advantages in gunnery and armour were negated. T-34s deliberately closed to point-blank range where even their 76.2mm guns could penetrate German heavy armour. The fighting was apocalyptic. Tanks rammed each other. Crews bailed out of burning vehicles only to be machine-gunned or crushed under tracks. The black earth turned to mud mixed with oil, blood, and pulverised metal. When the smoke cleared, both sides had suffered devastating losses. Soviet casualties were horrific, but they could be replaced. German casualties, particularly inexperienced crews and irreplaceable heavy tanks, could not. SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commanding a company of Tiger tanks at Prokhorovka, later wrote, "We destroyed them by the dozens. My company alone killed over 40 T-34s that day, but they kept coming, and coming, and coming. By afternoon we were out of ammunition. We withdrew with empty guns while Russian tanks still manoeuvred on the battlefield. We had won tactically. We killed 3 of theirs for every one of ours, but they were still attacking, and we were retreating. That's when I knew we had lost the war. You cannot defeat an enemy who can lose 10 tanks to your 1 and still have more tanks than you at the end of the battle." The Kursk offensive failed. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 until May 1945, the German army fought a desperate defensive war against an enemy who grew stronger while Germany grew weaker. The T-34 was at the forefront of nearly every Soviet offensive. Operation Bagration in June 1944 saw Soviet tank armies, equipped with T-34-85s, smash through Army Group Center, destroying 28 German divisions and advancing 600 kilometers in 6 weeks. German, commanders reported T-34 formations appearing suddenly from multiple directions, bypassing strong points and driving deep into rear areas in perfect imitation of German Blitzkrieg tactics from 1941. The difference was that Soviet logistics and coordination had improved dramatically, while German capabilities had deteriorated. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group Center during Bagration, reported to Hitler that Soviet armor tactics had evolved beyond German capabilities to counter. The enemy employs mass, speed, and depth in combination that we can no longer match. T-34 formations advance faster than our intelligence can track them. They bypass resistance and drive for operational objectives, leaving strong points to be reduced by following infantry. Most concerning, their mechanical reliability has improved to the point where sustained advances of 100 km per day are routine. Our own tanks, even the technically superior Panther and Tiger, cannot maintain such operational tempo. Mechanical failures and fuel shortages limit our mobility. We are being outpaced by an opponent we considered technically inferior just 3 years ago. The late-war T-34-85 was a matured weapons system that had corrected most of the early model's deficiencies. The 3-man turret gave the commander time to command rather than load the gun. Improved optics and vision devices enhanced situational awareness. Better radios improved coordination. Manufacturing quality had increased as Soviet industry gained experience. Yet the basic design remained recognizable as Koshkin's 1940 creation. The fundamental characteristics that had shocked German tankers at Msensk, the sloped armor, powerful gun, wide tracks, and reliable diesel engine, remained unchanged because they needed no change. The design was right from the beginning. By 1945, the Red Army was fielding entire tank armies with thousands of T-34s, supported by heavy IS-2 breakthrough tanks, self-propelled artillery, and mechanized infantry. These formations executed operations of a scale and sophistication that dwarfed the German Blitzkrieg that had initiated the Eastern Front conflict. The drive from Warsaw to Berlin saw Soviet tank armies advancing 600 kilometers in 3 months, crushing German resistance that had held Western allies at the Rhine for similar periods. T-34s were present at every major battle of this final offensive. At the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive position before Berlin, over 6,000 Soviet tanks, the majority T-34 variants, assaulted prepared German positions. The Germans had every advantage except numbers and mobility. They fought from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, abundant anti-tank guns, and even the latest Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. None of it mattered. The sheer mass of Soviet armor, sustained by logistics that could deliver fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles faster than losses could accumulate, simply overwhelmed the defense. Lieutenant Werner Adamczyk, fighting with a Volkssturm unit equipped with Panzerfausts at Seelow Heights, described the assault. The earth shook. That's the only way to describe it. Hundreds, maybe thousands of tank engines revving simultaneously. Then they came, a wall of T-34s advancing side by side, treads churning mud, guns firing. We destroyed the ones we could reach. I personally fired 3 Panzerfausts, 3 hits, 2 T-34s burning. It made no difference. For every tank we killed, 5 more took its place. They drove over our positions. Men disappeared under those tracks, crushed into the earth. The few who survived the initial wave were killed by infantry following the tanks. By the end of the day, our position had ceased to exist. The T-34 rolled into Berlin in April 1945, symbolically destroying the regime that had dismissed Soviet technical capabilities 4 years earlier. The iconic photographs of T-34s in front of the Reichstag represented not just military victory, but vindication of Soviet industrial and design philosophy. The final production numbers tell a story of overwhelming material superiority. From 1940 to 1945, Soviet factories produced approximately 57,000 T-34s of all variants. Germany produced roughly 24,000 tanks of all types in the same period, including light tanks, medium tanks, and heavy tanks. The T-34 alone outnumbered entire German tank production by more than 2 to 1. When combined with other Soviet armour, the numerical disparity was catastrophic for Germany. But numbers alone don't capture the T-34's impact. The psychological effect on German troops was profound and lasting. Veterans of the Eastern Front interviewed decades after the war consistently ranked the T-34 as the weapon they feared most. More than Katyusha rockets, more than Soviet artillery, more than the endless waves of infantry. The T-34 represented everything that went wrong with German assumptions about the war. Oberst Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated Luftwaffe pilot and dedicated tank hunter, who claimed over 500 Soviet armoured vehicles destroyed, mostly with the Stuka dive bomber, wrote in his memoirs about the T-34's impact on German morale. The appearance of the T-34 in 1941 was a psychological shock from which the German army never fully recovered. We had been told the Soviets were subhuman, incapable of producing sophisticated weapons. Then we encountered a tank that was superior to anything we fielded. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If the Russians could build the T-34, what else were we wrong about? Every subsequent encounter reinforced the lesson. They had more tanks, better tanks in many respects, and could replace losses we could not. German soldiers learned to respect Soviet industrial capacity in a way that Nazi ideology had taught them was impossible. The T-34's crude internal ergonomics, poor vision devices, and unsophisticated manufacturing actually became advantages in the context of total war. Tanks were destroyed regularly. Crews were killed constantly. The ability to produce tanks faster than they could be destroyed and train crews faster than they could be killed mattered more than individual vehicle sophistication. A poorly trained crew in a T-34 could survive long enough to become experienced because the tank's armour and mobility protected them through their learning curve. A well-trained German crew in a Panzer III or early Panzer IV often died in their first encounter with the T-34 because their vehicle simply couldn't compete. Soviet manufacturing philosophy embraced this reality. T-34 production lines operated continuously, with minimal concern for finish or detail. Welds were rough. Paint was often applied directly over rust. Internal components were assembled with tolerances that would horrify German engineers. But the tanks worked. They started. They drove. They fought. And when they were destroyed, 3 more rolled off the production line the next day. The Tankergrad factory in Chelyabinsk, which absorbed the evacuated Kharkov tank plant and became the largest tank production facility in the world, produced T-34s at a rate that seemed impossible. At peak production in 1943, the facility completed 1 tank every 30 minutes, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers, many of them women who had never seen a factory before the war, learned their specialized tasks and repeated them endlessly. Quality control consisted of driving the completed tank around a test track. If it made it around the track without breaking, it went to the front. If it broke, it was repaired on site and tested again. German intelligence officers examining captured Soviet production facilities after temporary occupations were stunned by what they found. Factories with dirt floors, minimal machinery and working conditions that would have triggered strikes in Germany were producing tanks in quantities that exceeded German output from purpose-built modern facilities. The realization was sobering. Soviet industrial capacity wasn't sophisticated, but it was effective in ways that German sophistication could never match. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin later wrote in his analysis of the Eastern Front, "We Germans were prisoners of our own excellence. We built tanks the way we built everything, with precision and care and attention to detail. Every panzer was a masterpiece of engineering. The problem was that masterpieces take time and resources to create. The Soviets built the T-34 the way they built everything during the war, quickly, roughly, and in overwhelming numbers. They understood something we did not, that in total war adequate weapons in quantity beat excellent weapons in scarcity." The evolution of German anti-tank capabilities throughout the war was essentially a race to counter the T-34. Every new anti-tank gun, every new tank, every tactical innovation was designed with the T-34 threat in mind. The 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, introduced in late 1941, was specifically developed to penetrate T-34 armour. The long-barreled 75mm gun on the Panzer IV, the Panther tank, the Tiger tank, even the monstrous 88mm PaK-43 and 128mm guns on late-war tank destroyers were all responses to the problem the T-34 posed. But the Soviets were not static. As German capabilities improved, so did the T-34. The introduction of the T-34-85 in early 1944 with its 85mm gun meant that Soviet medium tanks could now threaten even Tiger and Panther frontal armour at combat ranges. The 3-man turret improved crew efficiency. Better optics and vision devices reduced the situational awareness gap. Improved manufacturing quality enhanced reliability. By 1945, late production T-34-85s were remarkably refined machines. The crude interior of 1941 had been improved with better layouts and crew amenities. The transmission, always the T-34's weakest link mechanically, had been strengthened. The tracks and suspension had been improved. The tank that had shocked the Germans in 1941 had evolved into a mature weapon system that would remain in frontline service for decades after the war. In the final accounting, the T-34 achieved something no other single weapon system in World War II accomplished. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of its primary opponent. German operations on the Eastern Front after late 1941 had to account for T-34 capabilities. Offensives were planned around the need to counter massed T-34 formations. Defensive positions were sited with T-34 mobility in mind. Resources were diverted to develop counters to the T-34 that might have been used elsewhere. The cost to Germany was immeasurable. Billions of marks spent developing new tanks and anti-tank weapons. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours spent training crews and tactics, specifically for fighting T-34s. Countless operations delayed, modified, or abandoned because of the T-34 threat. Most significantly, the psychological impact of knowing that the enemy possessed superior numbers of tanks that were, in many respects, superior to German equivalents undermined German confidence at every level. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare, wrote in his memoirs with undisguised bitterness about the T-34's impact. In November 1941, I reported to the Army High Command that we had encountered a Soviet tank superior to any German tank then in service. I requested immediate action to develop countermeasures. The response was disbelief, then denial, then bureaucratic delays. By the time we fielded adequate counters, the Soviets had evolved their design and produced tens of thousands of T-34s. The industrial and tactical initiative had permanently shifted. We never recovered it. The T-34 didn't win the war for the Soviet Union by itself. Soviet victory required the sacrifice of millions of soldiers, the mobilization of the entire economy, vast quantities of Western aid, and numerous other weapon systems. But the T-34 was the shield and sword of Soviet armoured warfare. It protected Soviet tank crews while they learned their trade. It destroyed German armour faster than it could be replaced. It enabled the deep operations that liberated Soviet territory and drove into the heart of Germany. Perhaps the ultimate testament to the T-34's effectiveness came from the Germans themselves. In 1943, after extensive evaluation of captured T-34s, German designers proposed simply copying the Soviet design and putting it into German production. The proposal was seriously considered at the highest levels. German industry could produce T-34s using captured plans and retooled factories. The tank's crude manufacturing would actually simplify German production challenges. The proposal was ultimately rejected on ideological grounds. Hitler and other Nazi leaders couldn't accept that German soldiers would fight in Slavic-designed tanks. The propaganda implications were unacceptable. German racial superiority was a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. Admitting that Soviets had designed a better tank would undermine the entire ideological foundation of the regime. So instead, Germany developed the Panther, which incorporated T-34 lessons but added German sophistication and complexity. The Panther was arguably a better tank than the T-34-85 in most measurable parameters. It was also 3 times as expensive, mechanically unreliable, difficult to produce, and manufactured in numbers that were insignificant compared to T-34 production. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers during the war. The Soviet Union produced over 22,000 T-34-85s in the same period, in addition to 35,000 earlier T-34 variants. Post-war analysis by Western military historians consistently ranks the T-34 among the most influential weapons of World War II, often cited as the single most important tank of the conflict. Its combination of firepower, protection, and mobility set the template for modern main battle tanks. The sloped armour principle, pioneered by the T-34, became universal in post-war tank design. The emphasis on mobility and reliability over maximum protection influenced every subsequent generation of armoured vehicles. The T-34 remained in frontline Soviet service until the late 1950s. Modified variants served into the 1960s. Export versions fought in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East to Africa, well into the 1990s. Some T-34s saw combat in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, over 50 years after the design was finalised. No other World War II air tank can claim such longevity. For the Germans who faced it, the T-34 was a revelation that destroyed comfortable assumptions and forced painful reassessments. The Eastern Front veteran who had dismissed Soviet technical capabilities in June 1941 was, by 1945, a survivor who understood that German technological superiority was a myth that had cost millions of lives. Gefreiter Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace who survived the war with 150 confirmed tank kills, was asked in his 1970s interview what weapon he feared most during the war. His answer was immediate: the T-34. Not because any individual T-34 was particularly dangerous to a Tiger, we could kill them at ranges where they couldn't touch us, but because there were always more of them. You could destroy 10 T-34s in a single engagement and feel victorious. Then tomorrow, 20 more would appear. The day after, 30. They were endless. An army of crude but effective machines operated by increasingly skilled crews and supported by an industrial base we couldn't match. Individual German tanks were often superior, but wars aren't won by individual superiority. They're won by the side that can sustain losses and continue fighting. The T-34 gave the Soviets that ability. We never had an answer to it that mattered strategically. The story of the T-34 is ultimately a story about the difference between theoretical excellence and practical effectiveness. German tanks were marvels of engineering, sophisticated, powerful and expensive. The T-34 was a pragmatic weapon system designed to be produced in quantity, operated by minimally trained crews, and survive in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. German tanks were craftsmen's tools. The T-34 was an industrial product optimized for mass warfare. In the context of World War II on the Eastern Front, industrial logic defeated engineering perfection. The side that could put 50,000 adequate tanks in the field defeated the side that could put 20,000 excellent tanks in the field. The side that could replace losses faster than they accumulated defeated the side that couldn't. The side that designed for the war they were actually fighting defeated the side that designed for the war they wished they were fighting. When German commanders saw those first T-34s emerging from the fog near Msensk in October 1941, they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would break the Wehrmacht's back. They didn't know it yet. They still believed that German superiority in training, tactics and leadership would prevail. But the T-34 rendered those advantages insufficient. Superior numbers of adequate tanks, operated by adequately trained crews, supported by overwhelming industrial capacity, proved more than sufficient to defeat smaller numbers of excellent tanks operated by superb crews fighting for a nation that couldn't sustain its losses. The laughter died quickly. The confidence lasted a bit longer. But by 1943, every German soldier on the Eastern Front knew the sound of T-34 engines meant danger. By 1944, it meant probable death. By 1945, it meant inevitable defeat. The tank that emerged from the fog had come to stay, and it brought with it the mathematical certainty of German defeat. Industrial logic had spoken, and the sky over Berlin filled with the smoke of burning panzers and the thunder of T-34 diesel engines rolling through the ruins of the thousand-year Reich that lasted 12 years. The story of the T-34 is the story of how warfare changed in the 20th century. No longer were wars won by superior tactics and training alone. Industrial capacity, design philosophy, and the ability to sustain losses while inflicting greater losses became decisive. The Germans learned this lesson too late, paid for it in blood and steel, and watched as the tank they had mocked in 1941 carried the red flag to the Reichstag in 1945. The T-34 didn't just win battles. It won the war of attrition, the war of production, and ultimately the war itself.